Deuteronomy 21:23. Starting in verse 22, actually. If a man guilty of a capital offense is put to death, and his body is hung on a tree, you must not leave his body on the tree overnight. Be sure to bury him that same day, because anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. You must not desecrate the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Now, normally in their system, you would stone someone first, and then you would hang him up on a tree. In the Roman crucifixion system, you hang him up and he dies there. I mean, it's a being that came from the tree, so it's the same thing. But in the old days, you would kill someone and then hang their bodies up as a warning to other people. And culture that you would just leave the bodies hanging there. I mean, that was usually how it was done. In the Jewish system, you were supposed to take the body down before sunset. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward now. Jesus has died. He has uttered his last loud cry, which we know from other Gospels is, this is finished. That's what he said, it is finished. And breathed his last and gave up his spirit. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Not from bottom to top. If it had been from bottom to top, that could have been the priest doing that. Just from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." That is the climax of Mark's Gospel, actually. His intent was to demonstrate that Jesus was the Son of God. He said that all the way back in the very first verse. Mark 1 verse 1, the beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. He's taken all this time now to get back to his thesis. Well, not really back to it, but to get to that closing moment when someone in the story identifies Jesus. And it's like, in this case, it was the centurion who was officiating his death. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome, and she is the mother of James and John, sons of Zebedee. In Galilee, so back up in the home base, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. This is the first time we've heard about these people. This is near the end of the gospel. Jesus is already dead. Luke will spotlight them a little bit more, and we'll get a little bit. They were with him from the beginning. In fact, a couple of these women were mothers of some of his disciples, so they were acquainted with his ministry and involved in it in some form or fashion from the start. Although we only read about it in Mark here at the very, 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 very end. It was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Friday. So as evening approached, it would be 6 o'clock, it would be the evening. Sabbath began at sundown, which would be 6 o'clock. Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, that's the Sanhedrin, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. We'll find out that they know that he had died because they stuck a spear through his rib, and out came blood and water. But the other two on the other side of him had not died, so they broke their legs to make them die. Now, crucifixion killed you as a matter of suffocation. You would not be able to get enough air to fill your lungs as you hung there on the cross with your arms spread out. You would push yourself up with your legs to draw breath, and then you would sink down again, and you would just keep doing that until you gradually could not get any more breath. Breaking the legs made it impossible then for you to push yourself up and keep breathing, so you would suffocate a whole lot quicker. But they did not need to do that to Jesus because he had already died. Now this is actually important, and we'll read about this more in John, because Jesus says that no one takes his life from him, he willingly gives it up. And when it says he breathed his last here in Mark, we'll find out as we read the other accounts that he gave up his spirit Well, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. So he died on his own, even at the very end, he died on his own timetable. He did not hang there indefinitely until someone else came, until either the forces of nature took him or someone else came along and broke his legs. He willingly gave his life up when the moment had been reached to do so. So he gave the body to Joseph. Joseph brought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled the stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. That line is in there so that we know that these women were not mistaken and did not go to the wrong tomb the next day. They could not prepare his body for burial on the Sabbath, because that would be work, and they couldn't work on the Sabbath, so they had to do it beforehand. Sabbath started at sundown, so they had to get it in the tomb before sundown on Friday. When the Sabbath was over, so this is now Sunday, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, in fact they probably set out before sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb. They asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? They certainly couldn't do it. They're just a couple of women, probably older women too, for that matter. And they are the mothers, or some of them at least, are the mothers of some of Jesus' apostles. They're not going to be able to roll the stone away. But when they looked up, they saw the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. And we read in Matthew that it was also sealed too by the Roman guards, the temple guards, the Jewish authorities had gone to Pilate and asked permission to seal the tomb. They did that on the Sabbath, on the in-between day. And apparently the women didn't know that had been the case, because they don't seem to be concerned about the seal. They're just going because they hadn't seen it. They saw him laid in the tomb on the Friday, but they apparently didn't go there on the Saturday in between, and didn't know there was a seal and a cohort of soldiers there. Mark doesn't say anything about that, though. It's not relevant to Mark's purposes. When they looked out, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? Now go, tell his disciples, and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. They had to make a special mention there of Peter, because Peter needs extra encouragement. They all failed. They all ran from Jesus. They all fled and deserted him. So they all failed. None of them can look back on their actions that night as a success of any kind. But one of them failed even more than the others did, and that was Peter. So he is going to need extra encouragement to come back. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And that's it. That's how Mark's gospel ends, at least as far as we have it. Now you will see there is an extra column of text down there, which I am going to read, that this is undoubtedly not part of the original ending of Mark. This would have been added at some point later by someone who thought that the original ending, the ending that we have here, was not correct. I'm going to go ahead and read these last few verses, but keep in mind that this was not part of the original gospel. It was not written by Mark. It's questionable whether or not it was Holy Spirit inspired. You know, when you get into that kind of, I don't think anyone has any way of establishing that one way or another. It's basically a summary of the rest of the New Testament. It definitely reads like someone who came along later, knows the rest of the New Testament, and decided to put in an ending to Mark so that it didn't have just like that very abrupt cutoff that accounted for everything else we know. about Jesus' resurrection and the ministry of the early church as recorded in the rest of the New Testament. So nothing in here is wrong. But this is not part of the original Gospel of Mark. It was not written by Mark himself, and it's questionable whether we can even consider it inspired by the Spirit, but nothing in it is wrong. So I am going to go ahead and read it. When Jesus, because it is a nice summary of the rest of the New Testament. If nothing else, it is a pretty good summary of the rest of the New Testament and an insight into how the early church in the century or two after the Gospels were written saw it. Because this would have probably been written a couple of generations after the Apostles. So it is an interesting look into how the second or third or fourth generation after the original Christians saw it. When Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, which we'll read about in the Gospel of John, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. We'll read about that in the Gospel of Luke. Mark doesn't mention that. He's introduced as Mary Magdalene a few verses ago, said nothing about the 7 demons. That comes from Luke. And him appearing first to Mary Magdalene comes from John. She went and told those who had been with him and who were mourning and weeping. Again, that comes from John. When they heard that Jesus was alive and that she had seen him, they did not believe it. Afterward, Jesus appeared in a different form to 2 of them who, while they were walking in the country. That comes from Luke 24. Those returned and reported to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. And that comes from the other Gospels, basically. He said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned." That comes from Matthew. "And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name, they will drive out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands." That comes from Acts. All that comes from Acts. "And when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all." Now, there is no incident in the New Testament recorded of that happening. But it's possible that at some point it did happen with one of the apostles or somebody else. And the early church, the early generations of the Christians knew about it because it was a commonly known story in the early centuries of the church. But it is not, there is no incident anywhere in the New Testament that records that happening. They will place their hands on people and they will get, on sick people, and they will get well. Again, that comes from Acts. After the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was taken up into heaven, and he sat at the right hand of God. That comes from Luke and Acts. Then the disciples went out and preached everywhere, and the Lord worked with them and confirmed his word by the signs that accompanied it. Again, that comes from Acts and the epistles, I suppose. So that ending is not original to Mark. It was not written by Mark himself. It was probably not part of Peter's teaching, which is where Mark gets his materials from, and most likely isn't inspired and probably should not be considered as such with the rest of the New Testament. It is, however, it is in character. It fits with the rest of the New Testament. Everything in it basically is a summary of the rest of the New Testament, except that mention of drinking deadly poison. And it's possible that did happen at some point that the New Testament does not record, and the early generations of Christians knew about an incident like that. So there's nothing in it that's really wrong, but it's also not original to Mark and probably shouldn't be considered inspired. But it does provide us a good window into how the early generations of Christians saw that. Mark either originally ended with the whole women running from the tomb afraid, or he had an ending which is now lost. It's impossible to say either way. We'll have to ask him when we get there. There's decent arguments on both sides, and it really kind of depends on whether you think that Mark was trying to send a message home to his readers, his initial readers, the people who would be reading his gospel first, are you going to be, because they were in Rome. I don't know when exactly Mark wrote his gospel, but they would have been in Rome, in the heart of the enemy territory, and under the power of Caesar himself. And so the challenge could be that the gospel could end the way it does on purpose in order to issue a challenge to his immediate readers. Are you going to be afraid? Now, the women weren't afraid. We'll read about this in the other gospels, that they did tell. You know, they even corrected, whoever added the extra ending on to Mark even corrected that by having Mary Magdalene tell. So it's not really, you know, leaving it where it does is kind of interesting and odd, because the other Gospels do indicate the women weren't actually afraid to tell, at least not tell the others. The others were slow to believe, but I'm not really sure if it's correct to say they were afraid. Mary Magdalene stayed out of the tomb and saw him herself, which Mark doesn't seem to indicate. So it's possible there was an ending to Mark, maybe a column. Remember, they wrote everything in columns back then. That got torn off somehow or lost. It's possible. We'll never know. I mean, unless it's ever found. Unless some manuscript shows up somewhere down the line, buried in some house in Rome somewhere, that actually has a copy of Mark that with an extra column at the end that has the original ending. We'll never know until we get there and ask him. I'm inclined to believe that there probably was another ending initially, because it does seem, even if you put it in the context, even if you put it in the situational context of Mark issuing a challenge to his Roman readers of, are you going to be afraid or not? It seems like an odd ending, especially since the other Gospels go on to record the women speaking about this. Like, it doesn't seem as though they really were afraid. So that doesn't seem to be an accurate characterization of their behavior afterwards. So I tend to think that there probably was an extra ending in there that is lost now, but who knows. That was Mark. Okay, we finished the easiest gospel. It only took us a month, and who knows how many videos. Now, as I said before, as I read the others, we're not going to go back and look at the Old Testament passages. I have them marked here, for example. We're not going to go back and look at the Old Testament passages that are referred to in the other Gospels that we already did while reading Mark. Okay, because Matthew and Luke will both build on Mark and basically tell the same story that Mark is telling, but in a different way with different emphases. And so they will include a lot of the same information. And so when we have passages and quotations, or even similar callbacks or whatever, that point to the Old Testament and the other Gospels that we already covered while reading Mark, we're not going to go back and read those again because we already did. I want to assume that you know those and that you know how to go back and read those. Now, when we come across new stuff, and Matthew and Luke both have significant amounts of new stuff, when we come across new stuff that points back to the Old Testament, yes, we're going to go and look at those too. And Matthew will have a lot. He'll have a lot of prophets and he'll have a lot of law. Because Matthew was a Jew and he was trying to convince Jews, and the Jews they focused on two things: the prophets and the law. The law and the prophets. Okay? So there is a lot of law and a lot of prophets in Matthew, and there's a lot of references, direct quotations, callbacks, inferences, from the first word to the last, it's completely drenched in the Old Testament background. So there will be plenty of stuff to look at as we go through Matthew. But we're not going to look at the same stuff we looked at in Mark because we've already done that. And I'm assuming that you've already got that in mind and don't need to do that again, or if you do, you can do that yourself. So we'll move on to Matthew next. Okay, Matthew will be next, I believe, as I said before. Matthew. It's probably accurate to say that both Matthew and Mark were the first to write down Jesus' life. In just different ways. Mark was probably the first, I think of the four that we have here, almost indisputably the first, to write down the events of Jesus' life. And I think Matthew and Luke both built on that in their own Gospels. Matthew was probably the first to write down Jesus' teachings. And he may have even started working on that project before Mark started writing down about Jesus' doings. Somehow or another, these two things ended up merging. Matthew, I believe, at some point after he started writing down Jesus' teachings, just rewrote his gospel. I wrote it again from the ground up, incorporating the teachings along with events and probably following sequence of events as found in Mark, because most of Mark's events are also in Matthew, with a few additions, but not too many. So I believe Matthew essentially wrote his gospel twice. In fact, I think he probably continued working on his gospel for a long time. But he is going to have a lot more. Mark mentioned Jesus being a teacher a number of times, but didn't include very many examples of his actual teaching. A few, but not very many. A few parables, a few other instances, but not very many. We're going to have a lot of that in Matthew, and that's going to come straight from the Old Testament. It's going to be directly derived from the Law and the Prophets, and a lot of the imagery and symbolism and the way that even just the very way that Matthew has chosen to present and structure present his information and structure his story are going to be taken from the Old Testament. I mean, it's the Old Testament from the first letter to the last. So we are going to have plenty of that to come. In fact, it's so much of it that I'm not even ready to start doing it. I'm still going through Matthew and kind of working on I only had 4 note cards of citations that I wanted to read as I read through Mark, and Matthew I'm already at 4, and I'm only about halfway through. So it's like we're going to have a lot. Matthew's going to have a lot, but it won't be the same ones we did during Mark, because I've already done those. Even though a lot of the information in Mark is also going to be in Matthew, so don't forget it. It's all important. It's all part of the story, but we're not going to cover the information we already covered before in as much detail again.